Hi. So I'm Kate Taggart. I'm an engineering manager at HashiCorp. We build some things you may know like Terraform and Vault, software to provision, infrastructure, run, and manage secure applications. And I am hoping today to change the way that you think about hiring junior engineers onto teams responsible for production critical infrastructure. Now, this isn't some bleeding heart mission. I think that a lot of the excuses that we make for not hiring juniors belie risky practices. And then also just beyond all of your individual products, I think that neglecting to hire junior engineers into our industry will harm the future of our discipline. So that's what we're going to talk about today. But first, I want to tell you about my dentist. So I enjoy going to the dentist. I know that's odd. I have been told I have freakishly hard tooth enamel, and I'm 34 and I have 0 cavities. So that's probably why I enjoy going. My current dentist seems to be kind of a hotshot in the dentist industry. She's always going and speaking at conferences, and somehow, with her like several hundred patients or however many she sees, she always seems to remember exactly what was happening in my life 6 months ago, the last time that she saw me. So I saw her last month, and she was asking me, hey, like, I know you had a goal of speaking more this year. How's that going? And I told her that I had been speaking at various conferences and meetups, and it was going great, but that I had a keynote talk that I was kind of nervous for because while I'm comfortable with speaking, I hadn't done a keynote before. And she was like, oh, I just delivered a closing keynote at a dental conference in India. No joke, this is what she told me. And like, I can give you some advice about keynotes if you'd like. And I was like, yeah, that would be great, except dentists always insist on talking to you when they have their hands in your mouth, right? So really, I was more like, oh, that'd be great. But so what she gave me some really great advice that I incorporated into my talk, but you're not going to see like slides about dentistry, right? And so what I'm trying to express with this story, other than bragging about my 3.5 decade 0 cavity record, is that there is applicable wisdom to be found in unexpected places if you're on the lookout for it. And so with that, let's talk about bringing new people into our industry. So what the hell do I know about hiring junior engineers onto teams responsible for production critical stuff? When I worked at New Relic, I managed a team there that was responsible for about 85% of our web and API traffic. And I managed 2 Hackbright grads on that team. For those that don't know, Hackbright is a women-focused coding bootcamp based in San Francisco. So if you were a New Relic customer back in like 2015, about a third of the team that was keeping the main website up and running was fresh code school grads, which is pretty awesome. When I worked at Simple, it's a small online bank on the US West Coast. I managed one of the back-end engineering teams there, so we wrote the services that made sure we didn't lose your money, which is pretty important. And we hired a fresh CS grad onto that team, and she managed to not lose anyone's money, and everything was fine. We haven't hired a lot of junior team members at HashiCorp, and I'll talk a little bit about why later on. Until recently, like in the last couple months, we've started an apprentice engineer program, and we currently have 2 apprentice engineers, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So first, a point of terminology. The term junior engineer can be kind of problematic if you use it in the wrong context. So the way that I'm using it here is the key word is engineer, right? Like junior engineers are still engineers. They're just, like a sprout. It's still a plant. It's just newer, and it needs a little bit more care and feeding. As opposed to sometimes when people use the term junior engineer, it's meant to like other people, right? Where it's like, oh, well, you're not a real engineer, you're a junior engineer. Maybe someday you'll be a real engineer, kiddo. Don't use it like that. That's really diminutive and discouraging. Yeah. I also want to encourage you to think more broadly about the sources from which you can pull on junior engineers to your team. Sure, you can bring on people who are fresh from comp sci programs in college, but there are a host of other places that you can bring people onto your team from. Coding bootcamps is another source that I've had a lot of success with. People who have graduated college programs that aren't exactly computer science For example, I studied applied math in college, but there's a lot of programming in applied math, so those skills kind of transferred over. But then along a different dimension, also consider people who are already in the field, but maybe not in a strictly engineering role, right? So support engineers. I've worked with some really spectacular engineers who have come into engineering by way of support. Same thing with QA or security engineers. And even project managers or marketers. There's a decent amount of programming that goes on in the marketing profession these days, wanting to analyze big chunks of data, right? So think broadly. Okay, so as nerds, we love learning by breaking things, right? This is how many of us got into this field in the first place. And intentionally breaking things in production is becoming an accepted way to root out unseen problems in your production environment, right? We, throw roses and puppies and kittens at tools like Chaos Monkey. We had here at SREcon, there was a workshop on chaos engineering, right? So intentionally breaking things in production, this is something that we're becoming more and more comfortable with, right? So why then, when I ask people, why haven't you hired more junior engineers onto your team, I hear, well, we're worried they'd break things. Okay, but aren't you intentionally leaching code into production to do the very thing that you're telling me you're afraid junior engineers are going to do? It doesn't quite add up. So today we're going to bust a few myths. But first, I want to talk about why would you even want to hire junior engineers onto your team? So they bring some pretty great benefits. One, they bring a really great sense of curiosity and fresh perspectives. So they may see things that you or existing long-tenured team members may have missed. They bring a love for the game, right? They're young whippersnappers new to the field, and it can be a really good antidote to some of your more jaded senior engineers. Grunt work isn't necessarily grunt work for your junior engineers. There may be a lot of menial tasks that are not very fun for someone who's done them literally hundreds of times, but for a junior engineer, everything's new, and they're a really great team member to assign that kind of work to because it's actually a learning experience for them. And then lastly, great engineering managers know that putting together a high-performing engineering team is not just about assembling an army of clones, it's about putting together a heist crew. So take, for example, the use case of robbing a bank. You don't just want to get together 7 people that are all really good at going in and getting the money, because who's going to drive the getaway van? Who's going to listen for the police? Right? You're going to be screwed. So I haven't robbed a bank yet, but maybe someday. Okay, so on to myth busting time. The first one, I like to call this the Mr. Tough Guy fallacy. And Mr. Tough Guy says, our production architecture is so complicated, a junior engineer couldn't possibly understand it. Okay, maybe you can explain this really complicated production architecture to me in the light of day, but what happens when you're woken up at 3 in the morning and you're supposed to debug some outage on this production system? That is junior engineer? It's probably a pretty good approximation for 3 a.m. you. So try to find ways, if you can, to simplify your architecture. Or if you can't, and it just has to stay necessarily kind of complex, find ways that you may be able to better document it. When I was at New Relic and we hired on a principal engineer, and he was trying to wrap his head around all the various services that we had, one afternoon he just started throwing some poster paper up on the wall out of frustration to draw an actual by hand diagram of all of our services. And then we eventually tested out trying to preserve that in a little web app as well. So if you can't make your architecture more simple, try to find ways that you at least can document it so people can reason about it more easily. Myth number 2, this is the artiste fallacy. And Ms. Artiste says, our deploy process is an intricate 18-step process, and we can't trust a junior engineer to get all of the steps right. Okay, well, maybe your deploy process shouldn't be an intricate 18-step process. Maybe there are parts to it that you can automate to reduce the chance of human error, or stealing a point from this really great talk earlier today on what medicine can teach us about being on call. For the parts that still do require humans, maybe consider having checklists so that people have a guide to what they're supposed to be doing. Yeah. Okay, lastly, in tooling. So this is the Mr. Darwin Awards fallacy. Mr. Darwin Awards, Mr. Darwin Awards and a real-life person has actually said this to me. So we haven't hired any junior engineers onto this team. This was 2 weeks after I joined this company, by the way. Well, we haven't hired any junior engineers on this team yet because sometimes we have to update production database records by hand, and we can't trust a junior engineer to not just drop an entire production database by accident. And I was like, what have I done joining this company? But okay, we all have skeletons in the closet, right? So this is not to flame this employer. We've all got these skeletons, and leave places better than you found them, right? So okay, make sure that you have a tooling layer in between yourself and critical things in production, well, I shouldn't say what we had in that because it would scare you, but make sure you have a tooling layer that limits undesired destructive actions in production. And then also make sure, too, that you have streamlined backup and restore tooling as well, and make sure that you test it often. This is a really great opportunity to pair junior and senior engineers up together. Because if you go to your senior engineer and you're like, hey, I want you to test our backup and restore once a week, they're going to be like, seriously? But if you assign that task to a junior engineer, so long as they have some help, that's going to be a really great growth opportunity for them. Also, too, I'm a really big fan of the saying that you shouldn't be meeting your neighbors for the first time when your house is on fire. So pairing up team members to run through things like your backup and restore stories with some frequency helps build those human relationships before they are forced into working together thanks to an outage. Okay, so I'm not saying willy-nilly everyone just go out and hire a bunch of junior engineers onto every team everywhere, because there are some places that are better for them than others. So here are a few examples of environments that aren't great to hire juniors onto. If your team requires really extreme development velocity, that's not a good place for a junior engineer. Think a really early stage startup where you have to get the product out, otherwise you have no company. That's not a great place for a junior engineer. If there aren't any opportunities to support growth, so maybe you don't have anyone on your team who's interested in mentorship, that's a recipe for frustration as well. And lastly, if the role or product is not well defined, putting a senior engineer into a role where they're expected to kind of help define what the role is can be a really cool growth opportunity for someone who's later on in their career. But for someone who's new to the field, they don't even really know the basics of what's expected of that role. And so this is not going to be a good scene to bring a junior engineer into if it's not really clear what's expected of that role. So better environments to bring junior engineers into. Make sure that you have time for engineers to learn new things. This is important for all your engineers, right? Even if your senior engineers don't have time to learn new things, they're going to get bored and leave. But it's absolutely critical for your junior engineers, since by definition, they've got tons to learn. They need time to do it. Make sure that you're rewarding mentorship. So I've known a lot of organizations where they pay mentorship lip service, but they don't actually recognize it. So if you have engineers who make it their part of their job to mentor less senior team members, make sure that you're rewarding that. And I mean public recognition, promotions, raises. And then lastly, make sure you're setting clear expectations with your junior engineer and checking in often. One of the first things that's really important to teach a junior engineer is helping them calibrate that sense of healthy struggling, right? How much time should you spend toiling away in isolation, I have no idea how to solve this problem, before reaching out for help. So if you're checking in often, you can help them continue to calibrate that healthy struggling meter. Okay, so say I've sold you on the benefits of junior engineers and you've confirmed that you have an environment that's good to hire them into, but now you're okay, how do I find these junior engineers? How do I find the good ones? Well, let's think back to the benefits that I talked about. Make sure that you're getting these benefits. So when you're assessing candidates, look for these things. back when I was an engineer, one time I was tasked with mentoring an intern that had joined our team for a few months. And there were some assignments that when I tried to give them to him, he was like, oh no, that's beneath me, I'm not gonna do that. So that, we didn't really get the grunt work isn't grunt work benefit from that intern. We also didn't invite him back for a full-time role. But so make sure that you're actually getting these things from your junior engineers, right? And on the diverse skills front, if you've got a team that's all entirely CS majors, maybe don't hire an exactly the same person as a junior onto the team. Yeah. Oh, right. Oh, sorry. That's a super secret slide. You can't see it yet. So, okay. So these are things you should make sure that are there. But this doesn't really tell you anything about is this candidate going to be a really good SRE, right? Okay. So how do you assess that? I'm going to tell you to do something very dangerous. This is an expert level skill. But I will give you some guidelines to not cut yourself and others while using it. I'm going to tell you to hire for potential. And all of my fellow people from underrepresented groups in the audience are like, how could you? This is such a problematic concept. Don't worry. I'm going to talk us through this. So the reason that potential is often problematic is that it's an area where a lot of unconscious bias will creep in, even with very well-meaning people. If you aren't read up on this, Google is your oyster. But one example in which there's been a lot of studies is that men are often promoted based on an assessment of potential, whereas women are frequently only promoted after they've already been performing at the next level. So potential can be problematic, but there are ways to assess for it that will minimize bias. So first, what do I mean by potential? My definition of potential is how quickly is this person going to learn and acquire new skills? So in this way, you can apply this to more senior roles too, right? It's really about this person's velocity of acquiring new knowledge and skills. And so there's three components to that. The first is scrappiness. How does this person handle setbacks? A really great example of what I mean by this. One time I was managing a team. We had a team member who had recently come from a code boot camp, and before that he was a support engineer at a security company. And we were tasked with integrating a bunch of homespun Ruby tools with this new one login authentication system that we had a corporate mandate to integrate with all of our stuff. And so this team member was like, well, I'm just going to make a Ruby gem for this that does the SAML handshake that was offered by the custom API with the system, and then we can use it across all of our tools. Awesome. Only problem was the API endpoints that this authentication system offered for you to make your own custom SAML handshake were completely undocumented. They literally just gave you a list of the API endpoints and let you figure it out for yourself, which is kind of a disaster if you know SAML handshakes or not. Anyway, so this team member, he exhausted all possible options for trying to find some sort of documentation, right? But then later that day, I came back to him and was like, hey, I know we can't really find docs on this. We should probably consider other options. And he was like, oh, no, I got it figured out. What I did was I just started throwing random payloads of things that I thought or what they're expecting at these API endpoints. And then I was looking at the responses in Wireshark. I've already got all these API endpoints figured out. So that creating your own API documentation using Wireshark, that's a great example of scrappiness. Self-reflection is really important. So an old boss of mine said something along the lines of, a key to advancing your career is finding ways to learn more than 1 year's worth of experiences in a given year. And the only way you can do that, since we're all human beings moving through time at the rate of 1 year per year, presumably, maybe some of you have a Hermione time turner. That's rad if you do, but I don't, and probably most of us don't. So the only way to do that, to pick up experiences at this rate of more than 1 year per year, is to learn from the experiences of others. And in so doing, right, we need to be able to accept feedback from others because maybe they have perspectives on things that we're doing that we missed. So a person's capacity to self-reflect is a key ingredient in the potential recipe. And lastly, really important, especially for SRE work, is a team mindset. You're not going to be able to get as much done as an engineer if you're just the engineer that goes off into the corner to build something on your own. Like, sure, maybe you can build some cool stuff, but you're not going to build a system that can handle like millions of users all on your own, right? And even if you could, like, do you want to be the only one on call for that? Not really. So you need to make sure that your candidates very naturally think of the group's success as opposed to just their own. This is also really critical when it comes time for things like incident response, right? So that people don't fall into infighting. So these three things are what I think make up potential and what you should be screening for in your hiring process. And if you're wondering, like, okay, like this is really nice and abstract, Kate, but like what the hell do I actually ask people? I will share with you one of my favorite hiring screen questions that I use all the time. If you later interview with me, don't rehearse your answer to this. I will sense it. So the question is, can you tell me about a time that you had to balance doing things well or right and doing them fast? And this gets into all three of these things, right? So like in terms of scrappiness, I've had stories where people told me like, yeah, we thought we had 6 months to do this project, and then market conditions changed or whatever, and then we had to do it in 3 months. And I was like, oh, damn. Like, how did you manage that? Like, did you have to cut scope? Did you find a clever way to build things? Same with self-reflection and team mindset, right? Like, sometimes in response to that question, you'll get a good sense for how much people, like, railed against this decision that had just been, like, slammed down upon them, or did they take the time to understand the business constraints that they were operating in, right? So that's one example question. If you want more, you can like yell at me on Twitter or make up your own and tell me about them, because I'm always on the lookout for really good interview questions. Another thing to look for when you're hiring junior engineers, but this is completely optional. You can hire really amazing junior engineers without this, okay? But sometimes junior engineers come with superpowers, especially career changers who have already been in the industry but in like an associated function. So, for example, the two apprentice engineers that we have so far at HashiCorp, and to be clear what I mean by apprentice engineer, these are full-time engineering roles. After 6 months, they convert into a regular engineering title, but during the apprenticeship, they have like full medical benefits. Oh, sorry, you don't have to worry about that in the EU. That's super cool. Well, in the US, you're pretty screwed if you don't have health insurance, and so we offer full benefits to our apprentice engineers as well. And the two people that we have right now as apprentice engineers both have really cool backgrounds. One was previously, she was a Windows sysadmin for the Army Corps of Engineers. And for those that don't know, the Army Corps of Engineers is not like a forward deployed military thing in the US. They mostly do like civil projects, so helping protect against floods and things like that. So she had managed a Windows data center and done like a migration, and it like both of the data centers had to maintain various like DMZ zones during the migration. It was pretty rad. So she's with us now and learning how to build software. And our other apprentice engineer, she was previously a project manager, but the company that she came from expected project managers to fulfill the role of incident commander, like all the time. Like their team was on the hook for being incident commanders. And so she learned a ton about like high-level architectural like design of production systems, right, and how to respond when there are outages. And so one of the things that she's doing, like while spending a lot of time learning, is she's also helping us improve our own formal incident response playbook. So superpowers are really great if you can find them and leverage them, because it helps the junior engineer feel like they belong and they're being productive as early as they can be, while they're still learning other general things of the trade. So speaking of onboarding, this is another one of my favorite tools. So for those that don't know what an onboarding buddy is, it's when you take a team member and you assign them to like kind of shadow a new incoming team member. And this is really great to do for like your more senior engineers as well. But for junior engineers, they're going to need a lot more care and feeding, and so it really helps if you can spread that load around a few team members. Hence the onboarding buddy village. So there's a couple different ways that you can split this up. One way that I've done it, we hired a code school grad onto our team, and we sat down with her and 3 other team members, and we made this big Google Doc list of skills that we thought were critical for success on our team. And we went through and we asked her like her current comfort level with those various skills, right? So for one example, it was like that team wrote in Ruby and her coding boot camp had been in Python. So it was like, all right, like, we'll need to do a little bit of work there to get you familiar with this new language. But it won't be too bad. And each of the buddy villagers had an hour-a-week study session on the books with the junior engineer where they would just like work through those topics. And as they covered them, they'd cross them off in the Google Doc so we weren't like repeating effort among team members. So that worked pretty well. Another way that you may want to structure your buddy village is like by subject matter. So on another team, we were onboarding a new comp sci grad, and instead of all working off of one big list, we kind of just gave each person topics. So this team wrote their services in Scala, which was a new language to this junior engineer. And so we were like, okay, this person is like the Scala wizard on the team. So go to her if you have any questions about Scala. And this person, he pretty much like architected our whole log shipping thing. So if you've got questions about our logs, go to that guy. And so with this list, it was always very clear where the person should go to when they had questions. So both of those ways worked pretty equally well. But one thing that's particularly hard about bringing on junior engineers into an SRE context is that you're expecting people to have this like hybrid, ambidextrous skill set, right? Like we're expecting people to have a seasoned awareness of how to build good software, but then you also want people who have at least some passing familiarity with general ops concepts, right? And that's a lot to expect someone totally new to this discipline to learn all at once, right? It's like you're drinking from two lemonades at the same time. So one thing that I've thought a lot about, and I'd love to discuss more with anyone who has ideas on this, is how do you help cram as much like unique experiences from others into the learning of a new SRE as possible. One really great example is conferences, right? You get to come and learn from a bunch of other people, like horror stories that they've had, production outages or trying to upgrade part of their infrastructure. And so you get to learn from a lot of different people's experiences at the same time. And so, yeah, so conferences are a really great way. Reading up on publicly published postmortem retrospective documents is also a really great way to like collect these experiences. So yeah, this is something to be cognizant of when you're onboarding new SREs specifically, is that there's a lot to learn. So be very deliberate in finding very information-dense opportunities for them to learn. Okay, right. And then the last thing, component to successfully onboarding a junior team member is that you need to make sure that you're managing expectations. So that means managing expectations of the junior engineer, right? Like, is this job what they expected, right? They're new here. Maybe this isn't quite what they thought they were getting into. Or other team members who haven't worked with junior engineers before, like helping them understand like what's a reasonable level of progress to expect from the new team member. Or even yourself, like if you're a manager who's new to managing junior team members, like reach out to other managers who have experience with that to calibrate your own sense of what to expect. Yeah. Okay, so say, like you might be thinking at this point, like, wow, that's a lot of work. Like onboarding junior SREs is a ton of work, and I don't know if I feel like doing it, so I'm gonna kind of cheat and just like take away half of what you're saying, Kate, which is that we need to make sure that we're building, like architecting systems and developing tools and processes that are like resilient in the face of human error. Like that's all you're saying, right? I don't really have to hire junior SREs. Well, if that's all that you take away, well, you're wrong, you're cheating. Because junior SREs, they won't only highlight problems that you currently have, but they are also part of the solution, right? So again, going back to that grunt work isn't necessarily grunt work thing. Like if there are parts of your deploy process that need to be automated, right? Like that's a really good place perhaps to have a junior SRE help you with that. So don't just take away like, oh, okay, I'll make my stuff more resilient and not hire junior engineers, because they can help be part of the solution. And the last thing that I want to talk about just real briefly, because we've been focusing a lot on like what's the benefit to you and your product and your company personally, as far as hiring juniors onto your team goes. But I want to encourage you to think a little bit more broadly for a minute. So I want to talk about a point of failure that I see for us in our discipline at large. It's not a dumpster fire right now, but there's a tiny dumpster that's on fire off in the distance. We can avoid that fate. But when I was an engineer, one of the jobs that I had was I was a research programmer in a group that did power grid security and reliability studies. And in the power grid industry, at least in the US, maybe it's different here in Europe, there was this weird bimodal age distribution where everyone was either like 60, 62, or like 28. And there was like not really anyone else in the field in between those ages. And so all of the older people in the field, right, they were like, damn, like I want to retire in a couple of years. Like we got to get some more people into this field and teach them so that we can go have a good retirement instead of just, keeping the power grid up ourselves till we, kick the bucket. So I want I want to make sure that we avoid that same fate in the SRE discipline, right? So making sure that we are continuing to bring new people on, right, and coming up with effective ways to train them is really critical for that. One point that still sticks with me from, I don't know how many of you were either there or have watched online Tanya Riley's keynote from SREcon Americas back in March. But one point that she made that still sticks with me is there are all these industries in the last 60, 70 years that have been forced to grow up, usually through regulation, right? So take the airline industry, right? When it first started out, lots of people were dying. It was really dangerous. But now the airline industry is one of the safest around because they were forced to improve their safety practices and the training of employees, right? And so what the challenge that I want to leave us with is the following. Let's take our love for reliability and turn that eye towards our discipline as a whole, right? How can we find ways to effectively onboard, continue to support the growth of new people into our discipline so that our discipline as a whole will continue to be very resilient in the long run? And that's it.